The Silent Witness at Blackmoor Lake, a Hercule Poirot mystery. The knock at the drawing-room door had in it such naked urgency that the bridge game died before the butler entered. Lady Rosamond Aylesford, who had just lifted a card with the air of a sovereign signing an order, turned her head and said, "What is it, Baines?" The butler, usually so composed that one might have balanced china upon his nerves, looked faintly disarranged. "Mrs. Copley begs pardon, my lady. She cannot find the key of your dispatch case." Silence spread at once about the green table. The windows stood open upon the dark lawn and the still black breadth of Blackmoor Lake, but the change in the room was colder than the night air. Major Crispin Dale set down his cards with a cough. Lydia Grant lowered her eyes. Stephen Harcourt smiled too quickly. His wife, who sat apart with embroideries she had not touched, started ever so little. Hercule Poirot, whose own cards remained exact in his fingers, observed them all. "The key cannot lose itself," said Lady Rosamond. "No, my lady." "Then someone has taken it." She rose sharply. Lady Rosamond was a handsome woman past 60, silver-haired, upright, and impressively spare. She had the sort of authority that seems to improve a room merely by entering it, and punish it by disapproval. Weakness in others was an inconvenience she never bore cheerfully. "Remain where you are," she said. "If curiosity has outrun discretion, I advise the return of the key before the matter becomes vulgar." Stephen Harcourt laughed softly. "Surely that is a dramatic description of a household muddle." "It is exact," said Lady Rosamond, turning on him. "When the drawer in question contains negotiable securities." The laugh vanished, and looked at her husband with quick distress. Poirot had already learned from Lady Rosamond, before coffee, that disagreeable anonymous letters had lately arrived at Blackmoor Hall and that certain papers in her possession were of unusual importance. He had not expected the first explosion to come so soon. "To whom has the key been entrusted?" asked Hugo Fenwick, the family solicitor. "To no one." "Then perhaps Mrs. Copley has been careless." "Mrs. Copley has served me 18 years. She may err, she does not invent." Lady Rosamond gathered her shawl. "Baines, tell her I shall come at once." At the door she paused and looked back with an irony more unsettling than temper. "As secrecy appears no longer possible, I may add that the dispatch case contains, among other papers, the draft of a new will. If anyone has borrowed the key for enlightenment, enlightenment is now complete." Even Poirot, accustomed to seeing greed sit politely in drawing-rooms, noticed that each person now became aware of the others as possible claimants to something not yet dead but already being divided. Civilized people reveal themselves most clearly when still trying to remain civilized. Major Dale tugged at his mustache. Lydia's thread snapped in her fingers. Fenwick's eyelids lowered. Stephen's expression sharpened, and went very white. It was not the pallor of greed, Poirot thought, but of dread. "Rosamond," said Major Dale uneasily, "there's no need to talk as if we were criminals. When a thing has been touched, Crispin, I prefer to know which hand touched it." She went out. Baines closed the door. For a moment no one moved. Poirot laid down his cards. "A little domestic wind," he murmured, "and already the curtains stir." Stephen flung himself back in his chair. He was one of those men whose charm had survived too many tests to be honest. "If this is an inquiry," he said, "I deny all interest in wills. They invariably disappoint one." Lydia looked at him coolly. "You should say that to Mr. Fenwick. He files disappointment for a living." Fenwick straightened the score pad. A better occupation than creating it. And rose suddenly. Please, she said. Must we begin this? My mother enjoys scenes when she directs them. I cannot bear. She stopped, ashamed of the protest. Poirot turned his head. Through the open door into the morning room he could see a lamp, a writing table, and on the far wall a watercolor of Blackmoor Lake in a thin gilt frame. It hung a little crooked. The defect was slight, but in a house where books, flowers, and visiting cards all seemed drilled to attention, it had the effect of a tiny insult. Madam is troubled by disorder, he said gently, and pressed her hands together. My mother is troubled by whatever she has not arranged herself. The answer carried more truth than rebellion. Her eyes filled at once, and Poirot marked the contradiction. One may resist a tyranny, and yet remain bound to it by love. Before anyone could speak, there came from the morning room a light crash, then a cry cut off so sharply that it seemed not to end but to be snatched away, and stood frozen for a second and then was through the door. The others followed, Poirot with them. The morning room was bright, orderly, and suddenly monstrous. Lady Rosamond lay beside the writing table, the shawl fallen back from her shoulders. The ivory paper knife from the desk stood out white and indecent against her dark gown. Mrs. Copley had collapsed against the wall with one hand to her mouth. Near the dead woman's hand lay Stephen Harcourt's cigarette case, its silver monogram shining in the lamp. The French window to the terrace stood open, and the curtain moved inward on the damp air from the lake. Above the desk the watercolor hung more crooked than before, as though the whole room had been struck out of line, and stopped on the threshold as if the room had struck her in the face. Stephen reached her first, not with tenderness but with instinct, catching her elbow before she swayed. Fenwick went down upon one knee beside the body. Major Dale muttered a broken oath. Lydia, very white, caught Mrs. Copley as the maids had slipped back against the wall. Only Poirot looked first not at Lady Rosamond, but at the little field of disorder her fall had made. The writing table had been left open. A drawer stood out by 2 inches. One candle on the mantel had guttered sideways, spilling wax upon the polished shelf. The silver blotter had slid to the carpet. And near Lady Rosamond's hand Stephen Harcourt's cigarette case lay with a precision almost insolent, as though it wished to be noticed before anything else. She is dead? And whispered. Fenwick rose slowly. He had a legal mind, and legal minds dislike the intimate vulgarity of violent death. Quite dead. Stephen looked from the paper knife to his cigarette case, and the color altered under his skin. That infernal thing is mine, he said. At least it was. I have not seen it since dinner. Convenient, said Lydia. He turned on her sharply. My dear Lydia, when one is being manufactured into a murderer, convenience belongs to somebody else. Major Dale moved to the French window and stared out at the terrace. The stones beyond were damp with the evening mist from the lake, and farther off the balustrade showed pale against the dark lawns. There may have been someone outside, he said. By God, there must have been. Poirot bent over the threshold. The rug had been disturbed by the rush into the room, yet the strip of polished floor immediately within the window remained clear. On the sill lay a grain of dark soil and a little apart from it, the stub of a match not fully burned. Baines, said Poirot, you will please see that no one leaves the house. The butler, who had followed and now stood like a shocked monument, inclined his head. Yes, sir. Stephen gave a short laugh. And by what authority do I become a prisoner? By that of common sense, said Poirot pleasantly. When a lady is killed, the guests do not take the air. And drew herself away from her husband and came a step into the room. There was horror in her face, but behind the horror something strained upward like a creature pressing under ice. My mother sent for someone, she said. She would not have come here alone merely because of a key. She had already told them, Poirot, there had been letters. Fenwick glanced at her. What letters? Poirot answered before she could. Anonymous communications of a disagreeable character. Lady Rosamond feared that a person within this house had an interest in certain papers. Mrs. Copley began to cry soundlessly. Lydia led her to a chair. I looked only for a moment, my lady said. Only for a moment. The key was always in the blue tray. Always. Do not reproach yourself yet, said Poirot. Fenwick said, This is a matter for the police. Assuredly. Major Dale, perhaps you will telephone. Dale went at once, with relief. Action is a narcotic to men who are helpless before feeling. Stephen remained where he was, one hand in his pocket, one on the back of Anne's chair. To any stranger he might have appeared insolent. Poirot, who noticed the pressure of his fingers whitening at the knuckles, judged that fear had merely chosen its least respectable mask. Lydia knelt to pick up the fallen shawl, then checked herself and looked at Poirot for permission. He nodded. As she lifted it, a folded sheet of notepaper showed white beneath the fringe. Fenwick stooped faster than she did and took it up. It is blank, he said after a glance. A note turned face inward, perhaps, suggested Lydia. Fenwick looked again. No. Merely a torn half-sheet. Poirot accepted it from him. The upper edge had been ripped unevenly from a larger page. There was no writing upon the visible side, but one corner bore the faint impressed mark of a heavy hand that had written on the sheet above it. Another small silence moved through the room. A torn page was not evidence, it was only appetite for evidence. He crossed at last to the wall above the writing table. The watercolor of Blackmoor Lake still hung crooked, the winter reeds slanting downward as though the painted marsh itself had begun to slide. Dust had gathered evenly along the top of the frame except at the right corner, where a cleaner line showed. Poirot let his eyes rest there for an instant, and then turned away. Did your mother keep papers behind pictures? He asked, as lightly as if the question were idle. And stared. Behind pictures? No, at least I do not think so. Stephen said, My mother-in-law kept papers behind people. She preferred them where they could neither breathe nor answer back. Stephen, and said. Her rebuke was so quick and sharp that for a second she looked startlingly like the dead woman, then the resemblance vanished. From the hall came the distant grinding of the telephone, and the murmur of Major Dale's voice. Baines closed the French window. The curtain, checked in its movement, fell straight. With the neatness of the act the room seemed even more violently wrong. Poirot held up the torn half-sheet. Until the police arrive, he said, we will all assist by remembering exactly. Who last saw Lady Rosamond alive? Who last saw this gentleman's cigarette case? And who, M.S. Amos, had reason to fear what was in the dispatch case? No one answered him. But in that pause each face declared a separate allegiance, to money, to pride, to habit, to love. Poirot saw, too, that Anne's gaze had gone not to the body and not to her husband, but once, swiftly and unwillingly, to the crooked picture above the desk. The look vanished almost before Poirot had caught it, and then turned away as Major Dale came back, declaring that the police were on their way from Market Densham. Behind him, drawn by disaster as smaller birds are drawn by a hawk's shadow, appeared Miss Vera Elcombe, Lady Rosamond's companion. Her iron-grey hair was perfectly smooth, her black dress severe, and her face composed save for the eyes, which were too bright. "Rosamond?" she said. No one answered quickly enough. Vera saw the body, made a slight movement as if checking herself from advancing, and stood still. "Who found her?" asked Poirot. "Mrs. Copley called out," said Vera. "I was in my room writing letters." "At what hour?" "I did not look at the clock." "You write letters during bridge?" Stephen inquired with lazy insolence. "I do many useful things while other people play games." The answer was exact enough to earn from Lady Rosamond's daughter an involuntary flinch. Poirot began then the small, quiet catechism by which ordinary falsehood first grows uncomfortable. Major Dale had been in the smoking room before bridge and on the terrace after coffee for 5 minutes. He said this with a frankness that sought credit for itself. Fenwick had come directly from the dining room to cards. Lydia had gone upstairs for a reel of silk and returned. Stephen had mislaid his cigarette case sometime before dinner, perhaps in the hall, perhaps in the library, and had spent most of the evening where everyone saw her, though once she had gone to fetch a shawl for her mother. Vera had been in her room. Mrs. Copley had been looking for the dispatch key. Baines had been in the pantry with the footman. "Why was Lady Rosamond changing her will?" Fenwick asked abruptly. Lydia smiled faintly. "You phrase that as if you did not draft it." "I drafted more than one." "Lady Rosamond seldom altered her mind without first recording how nobly difficult it had been," Vera said. "She had every right to dispose of her property as she pleased." "Indeed?" Stephen's eyebrows lifted. "And were you among the pleased, Miss Elcombe?" Color entered Vera's face, sudden and unbecoming. "I was among those who served her." "Yes," said Lydia coolly. "That was the trouble with my aunt. She mistook service for gratitude and gratitude for obedience." Poirot watched, and while the others fenced. At mention of the will her expression did not sharpen toward money, as Lydia's had done or Fenwick's had guardedly done. Instead it clouded with the old, childish apprehension of a daughter waiting to hear what judgment a parent has passed upon her life. Inspector Renshaw arrived with a village constable, and the air of a man who has come expecting burglary and found a salon tragedy instead. He knew Poirot by reputation, greeted him with proper respect, and accepted within 3 minutes that nothing in the house was to be touched. Within 10, he had also accepted Stephen Harcourt as the obvious suspect. "The window open, his cigarette case, money difficulties known to the family," he began. "Known to the family," repeated Stephen. "And, it appears, to the county." Renshaw ignored him. "Did you quarrel with Lady Rosamond?" "Frequently. She considered it a family exercise." "Did you ask her for money today?" Stephen hesitated. It was a very slight hesitation, but it had the shape of truth deciding whether to risk itself. "Yes," and closed her eyes. "For what purpose?" "To pay a debt." "A gambling debt?" "If you insist on the picturesque term." Renshaw's pencil moved with satisfaction. Major Dale shifted heavily in his chair. It was plain that half the room now considered the business complete. He crossed to the writing table and held the torn half-sheet under the lamp. The impressed lines on it were still unreadable, only a blind furrow of pressure. Nearby, in the small leather tray where pens and seals lay aligned, there was no dispatch key. Above him the picture of Blackmoor Lake remained awry. Vera moved suddenly across the room. "That is intolerable," she said, and straightened it with careful fingers. The act was so natural that no one but Poirot and Anne appeared to notice it. Beside the clock stood 3 little silver swans, their necks curving toward the painted water beyond. She left the third one half an inch apart from the others and withdrew her hand as if from temptation. "Miss Elcombe," said Poirot softly, "Lady Rosamond kept no papers behind the frame?" "No. She disliked such habits. She said they were middle class?" The answer came too readily, and perhaps for that reason Renshaw turned an eye upon her. "You seem very certain." "I lived with her for 11 years, Inspector." "And loved her?" asked Poirot. Vera looked at him as though he had committed a vulgarity. "One does not use such words of an employer," Renshaw said briskly. "I shall want everyone's movements written out in order. Mr. Harcourt, you will remain available." Stephen bowed. "How courteously the English language imprisons a gentleman." At that moment Baines entered with an envelope on a salver. "This was found in the hall stand, sir. It appears to have fallen behind the drawer." The envelope was addressed in Lady Rosamond's hand to Mr. Hugo Fenwick and sealed, though not stamped. Fenwick took it, frowned, and looked at Poirot. "Open it," said Renshaw. Inside was a single line. "If anything unpleasant occurs tonight, ask M. Poirot why the lake picture has been disturbed." No one spoke. Poirot saw the words strike each mind differently, fear in Anne, annoyance in Vera, alert calculation in Fenwick, almost relief in Stephen, who sensed the spotlight swerving, and in Lydia a keen, cold curiosity that had more courage than kindness. Renshaw turned sharply toward the wall where the picture now hung straight and innocent above the desk. "It seems, Monsieur Poirot," he said, "that the dead lady has left us a direction." Renshaw did not wait for anyone's permission. He stepped to the wall, lifted down the watercolor, and turned it over upon the writing table. A faint rectangular mark on the wallpaper showed where it had hung for years. Behind it there was nothing but the tarnished nail and a pale square less darkened by time than the rest of the paper. "Nothing," said Major Dale heavily. "On the contrary," said Poirot. "There is the excellent habit of a lady who wished to be cryptic after death." Fenwick examined the back of the frame. "The fastening has been opened lately." It was true. One corner of the brown paper backing had been slit and pressed down again. Not clumsily, only hurriedly. Renshaw's attention sharpened at once. "So something was hidden there and has been removed?" "Or was hidden there once," said Fenwick. "By whom?" Lydia demanded. No one answered. Poirot watched Anne. She had drawn farther from the table, but not before her gaze had measured, almost against her will, that cut corner at the back of the frame. Vera's eyes, on the other hand, had gone instantly to Fenwick. Renshaw began to divide the room into practicable English questions. Who knew of the hiding place? Who had touched the picture? Who had had occasion to enter the morning room before the cry? Mrs. Copley admitted that she had passed through to fetch a shawl, and had done the same. Vera had arranged flowers there at 6 o'clock. Fenwick had spoken with Lady Rosamond by the desk before dinner. Stephen, with charming candor, could not be sure whether he had sauntered in after luncheon or not. Major Dale had not. Lydia had been there to borrow sealing wax. "At least," said Stephen, "the dead lady's posthumous wood has done me one service. I am now only one suspect among the chorus." Renshaw looked at him with disfavor. A chorus in which your note is still the loudest, sir. A pity, said Stephen, for I seldom sing in tune, and turned on him suddenly. Why must you speak like that? The words escaped her with genuine desperation. Stephen stared, then his face softened, not with repentance, which was not his habit, but with a sort of boyish dismay. Because if I do not joke, my dear, I may do something unforgivably English and feel. That, thought Poirot, was true. Frivolity is often only emotion with a monocle. Renshaw asked for the dispatch case. Mrs. Copley brought it locked. It was a dark leather box, severe and expensive, bearing Lady Rosamond's initials. The key was still missing. Fenwick, after brief hesitation, produced another from his watch chain. She gave me the duplicate years ago, he said. The inspector opened the case. Inside lay securities, a jewel packet, letters tied in green ribbon, and a folded legal draft. Fenwick glanced at it and said quietly, "It is indeed a new will." "Does it benefit Mr. Harcourt?" asked Renshaw. "No." Stephen laughed once, without amusement. Lydia's mouth tightened. Vera looked at Anne. "And whom does it benefit?" Fenwick hesitated. "Miss Grant, principally. Certain charitable bequests. Lady Rosamond's daughter provided for by trust. Mr. Harcourt excluded from control of any portion." The blow had been expected by some, but expectation does not lessen humiliation. Stephen's face hardened into a brilliance almost handsome. "A masterpiece," he said. "The old lady kills me socially before she is killed physically." And did not look at him. She stood with both hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles showed white under the skin. In that moment Lydia, who had always despised weakness, looked at her cousin with an odd and sudden pity. Poirot moved to the mantel, where the picture lay face down. Beside the clock the 3 silver swans had been displaced when Renshaw lifted the frame. He set them into a row with absent delicacy, then paused. One of the little birds bore, along its polished side, a faint streak of reddish wax. "Was sealing wax used here this evening?" he asked. Lydia answered. "I borrowed some after dinner. From the tray in the morning room. I had a note to finish." "Red wax?" "Yes." Renshaw at once requested the note. Lydia colored faintly, and said it had been to her bank manager. Fenwick meanwhile examined the slit in the backing paper. "A paper once hidden here might have been removed before the murder, and yet still explain Lady Rosamond's warning. She may have discovered the theft earlier." "Then why come alone?" asked Major Dale. "To trap the thief," said Vera. Her tone was so decided that all looked at her. She met them with that hard bright gaze of women who have long ceased to plead for interpretation. Rosamond never appealed. She cornered. And whom was she cornering tonight? Poirot asked. Vera answered after a fraction too long. Mr. Harcourt, plainly. Again the easy road presented itself. Money, exclusion from the will, a planted cigarette case that perhaps was not planted at all. Poirot, however, noticed something small and obstinate. If Stephen had seized the paper knife in rage, why had Lady Rosamond's chair remained almost square to the writing table? A violent quarrel by the open window, as the inspector already seemed to picture it, should have cast the room into a wider untidiness. But the disorder here was selective, almost composed. Baines entered softly. "Dr. Henley is below, sir." "Show him in." Renshaw turned to Poirot. "Until we know more, no one leaves Blackmoor." The doctor came briskly, bent over the body, and confirmed what every eye had already learnt. Death had been nearly instantaneous. Lady Rosamond had not had time to cry out twice. Poirot watched, and then she did not faint, nor even tremble. Instead, she looked at her mother's still hand upon the carpet with a concentration almost childlike, as though death had stripped away terror and left only an old, baffled love. Then, lifting her head, she said in a voice that scarcely seemed her own, "Inspector, if you must suspect Stephen, suspect me too. I was the one she wished to punish." The room turned toward her together. For a second no one spoke because the words themselves seemed impossible in Harcourt's mouth. She had always possessed that dangerous kind of gentleness which tempts stronger natures to arrange her life for her, and weaker ones to disregard it. To hear her ask for suspicion was like hearing a dove demand judgment. Renshaw recovered first. "Why do you say that, madam?" "Because it is true." She drew a breath with difficulty. "My mother had not trusted Stephen for a long time. Lately she had ceased to trust me as well. If there was a scene tonight, it concerned both of us." Stephen took a step toward her. "And don't be absurd." She turned with sudden weariness. "I am tired of absurdity. It has been the furniture of our lives." The phrase, so unlike her ordinary speech, silenced him more effectively than anger would have done. Poirot saw that what frightened Stephen was not accusation but alteration. A compliant woman may be loved carelessly. When she begins to speak in her own voice, she unsettles the entire household. Renshaw led Anne into the library, the others following as far as the door, and then lingering just beyond it in that hypocrisy of distance by which families persuade themselves they are not listening. The library at Blackmoor was long, dark, and honorable, smelling of leather and old fires. The curtains had not yet been drawn across the windows to the lake, and the black water beyond seemed to wait with more patience than any human witness, and remained standing. "My mother learned this week that Stephen had signed his own name to certain securities she had refused to release. He meant, I think, to replace them before anyone noticed. He is foolish, not wicked." To my mother the distinction did not exist. Stephen made an impatient movement, but Fenwick's lifted hand stopped him. She said, and continued, looking not at her husband but at Poirot, that if there were another scandal she would separate us entirely. She would settle money upon me under trustees and send our little girl abroad to school at once. She had already spoken of arrangements. Everything with my mother became arrangements. The words came quietly. "That was why they carried so much pain," Renshaw said. "Did you go to Lady Rosamond after she left the drawing-room?" "Yes," Stephen exclaimed. Vera shut her eyes briefly. Lydia's face hardened, not in censure now but in concentration. "How long after?" "A minute or two. I wanted to beg her not to disgrace Stephen publicly. I found her standing by the writing table. She told me she had sent for Mr. Fenwick next. She said, and stopped. She said she was tired of weakness in others and of cowardice in herself." I did not understand then what she meant. "What happened?" "She dismissed me." "Was there a quarrel?" "Yes. But not such a one as—" Her eyes moved involuntarily toward the morning room. "Not that." "How did you leave her?" "Alive." Renshaw's pencil paused. "Through the door or the French window?" "The door." "Did you notice the picture above the desk?" And looked startled. "The picture?" "Yes." "Was it crooked then?" A little color drained from her lips. "I cannot say." Poirot, who had been almost idle until now, spoke with great softness. Yet you notice such things, madam. Anne's hands gripped the back of a chair. My mother noticed them. Ah, said Poirot. And daughters learn by living under the eyes of their mothers. She gave him then a look at once grateful and terrified, as if he had named a private ailment. There are women who become what has ruled them long after they imagine themselves in revolt. Renshaw asked, Did you see Mr. Harcourt's cigarette case? No. Stephen laughed suddenly. My case has developed a social life of its own. Soon it will be asked to dinner. No one smiled. He colored, and in that instant Poirot saw the truth that Stephen concealed from the world even while advertising his vices. He loved and badly perhaps, selfishly certainly, but with real alarm for her happiness. His debts were casual. His feeling was not. Lydia from the doorway said, She came back by the hall. I saw her. And turned. Yes. You had your sleeve torn. All eyes went to the pale blue silk at Anne's wrist. There, near the seam, a small thread had lifted and been clumsily pressed down. I caught it on the handle. And said quickly, Of which door? Asked Poirot. The morning-room door. Curious, said Fenwick, for the handle is smooth brass. She looked at him then with a flash of something so sharp that even he was startled. Must every word be weighed as if I stood in the dock? Yes, said Renshaw, before anyone else could speak. Anne's face altered, not into resentment, but into fatigue so deep it was almost relief. Poirot crossed to the mantel, where in the agitation of the moved logs the brass horse and pair had shifted slightly from its central place. Above it hung a mirror reflecting the open library door and beyond, a narrow glimpse into the morning room. In that slice of view the watercolor of Blackmoor Lake was just visible again upon the wall, replaced now and apparently straight. Yet Poirot noticed that one lower corner cast a shade different from the other. It did not sit flush against the wallpaper. Inspector, he said, we may perhaps ask next not only who wished Lady Rosamond dead, but who wished something taken from her keeping. Renshaw nodded, though unwillingly. At the threshold Vera spoke for the first time since Anne's admission. If she has told you there was a quarrel, then she has told you enough to condemn her husband. And faced her. No. Enough to condemn my mother. The two women looked at one another across the old carpet and the listening room, Vera rigid with self-command, and trembling on the edge of self-discovery. Poirot had the curious impression that the murder, dreadful as it was, had broken more than one old arrangement in the house. The impression persisted even after Renshaw dismissed and to Mrs. Copley's care. When she had gone, leaving a small vacancy of pale blue silk and exhausted dignity behind her, the others seemed rearranged by her absence. Stephen lost some of his insolent animation, like an actor deprived of the audience for whom he has been playing. Vera became more rigid. Lydia, who had always been exact, grew almost severe with purpose. Renshaw turned to her at once. You said you saw Mrs. Harcourt return by the hall. At what moment? Very soon after Lady Rosamond left the drawing-room. I had come down from upstairs with the silk, and came out of the morning-room and crossed the hall. She did not see me until she was near the stairs. Was she agitated? Yes. Though that proves little. Did she carry anything? Lydia hesitated. I am not sure. Perhaps only her handkerchief. Stephen said sharply. You are never unsure, Lydia. That is what makes you so exhausting. It makes me useful. she replied. Poirot intervened before the exchange could sour further. And the cigarette case, mademoiselle? Have you seen it since dinner? Yes. It was in the silver tray on the hall table with Mr. Dale's gloves and my aunt's lorgnette. I noticed it because the monogram had caught in the fringe of the runner. Renshaw looked up at once. You are certain? Quite. Stephen gave a little bow from the armchair into which he had dropped. My compliments. The news, at least, will now require some tailoring. The inspector frowned. Anyone passing the hall might then have taken it. Exactly, said Poirot. Major Dale, who had been silent, spoke with effort. Rosamond lent me money last month. Renshaw swung round. How much? 1,000. Stephen let out a low whistle. Fenwick lifted his brows. Lydia looked merely disgusted. I told you because if there was trouble about papers or a will, you would hear of it. She had become infernally difficult over repayment. I asked for time this afternoon. Was there a quarrel? There was Rosamond. That generally covered the essentials. And where were you when she left the card table? Still in the drawing room. Ask anybody. It was true. Yet Major Dale's confession shifted the emotional weather of the room at once. Debt is democratic. It lowers a gentleman and ennobles a theory. Renshaw wrote busily, relieved to acquire another man of means and motives. Poirot, however, had gone to the hall. The silver tray stood on the long table beneath a lamp. Lady Rosamond's lorgnette lay there still, folded like a reproach. Beside it were Major Dale's gloves, one finger turned inward. The runner had indeed a small loose thread where something sharp might have snagged. On the polished wood below the tray, scarcely visible except when the light struck slantwise, there was the mark of a rectangular object lately moved through dust. Vera had followed him soundlessly. You are thinking the case was planted. I am thinking that objects are often more truthful than their owners. And what do the objects say here? That someone with composed hands passed this table after dinner. For the first time that night the mask of professional companionship slipped from her face and showed plain hostility. You suspect me because I keep my hands composed? I suspect everyone for some reason. It would be negligent not to suspect the person who straightened the picture before the inspector could examine it. She stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, though without mirth. Rosamond used to say the same. She distrusted quick tidiness. She thought it the vice of servants and criminals. And was she right? Vera's answer came in a tone flat with old fatigue. She was often right in the wrong way. That sentence remained with Poirot. One may speak more truth from resentment than from affection. When they returned to the library, Fenwick had opened the sealed envelope again and was studying the one line it contained as though, being a solicitor, he might extract a second line by pressure of intellect. Lydia stood at the mantel beneath the mirror, one hand resting on the brass horse. The pose made her look older, more resolute, and suddenly rather lonely. You inherit a great deal if the will stands, said Poirot. She met the observation directly. Yes. Do you wish it to stand? Tonight? No. It was not an answer many young women would have chosen when money had just come walking toward them across a corpse. Poirot approved of it because it was neither sentimental nor prudent. She was impossible, Lydia said after a moment. But one does not expect impossibility to end in blood. It cheapens everybody. There spoke the central truth of Lydia Grant, not tenderness, but standards. Some people suffer most from humiliation, others from grief. From the far room came the murmur of Dr. Henley within. Stephen half rose, then sat down again. His entire body leaned toward the closed door, while his face pretended indifference. Poirot, seeing this, understood that Stephen's worst sins had been committed in the confidence that women would forgive him. Such men are dangerous, but not always murderous. He turned then toward the open door of the morning room. Under the lamp, beyond the shadowed threshold, the watercolor of Blackmoor Lake looked harmless once more, the reeds pale, the water still. Yet the lower right corner continued to stand slightly away from the wall. It resembled a shut mouth not perfectly closed. "Inspector," said Poirot quietly as Renshaw joined them, "if one paper has vanished from behind that picture, another may have vanished from the desk. Let us see whether Lady Rosamond wrote more this evening than she intended others to find." Renshaw nodded and called for the blotting book. Renshaw brought the blotting book from the morning room and laid it under the library lamp. Fenwick at once proposed chemical methods, doctors' lights, and other respectable violences to paper. Poirot declined them all and asked simply for a soft pencil. "What do you expect to find?" the inspector asked. "The vanity of the letter writer," said Poirot. "People believe that when they blot a page, they have buried it. In truth, they have asked the paper to remember for them." Very lightly he shaded the last used leaf. Little by little the impressed words thickened into fragments. Not enough for a full sentence, never that easy, but enough to suggest the line of a thought. Trust to be altered. Child to be sent. Harcourt not to, then a break, and lower down, M. Poirot has advised caution. And gave a low sound, not quite a cry. Stephen closed his hand over the arm of his chair. "Then she had written to you?" said Renshaw to Fenwick. "Yes." His face had grown grayer, but not, Poirot judged, from guilt. Fenwick feared scandal as a physician fears infection. "She meant to instruct me formally about sending away Mrs. Harcourt's daughter," said Poirot, and stood very still. "So it was decided." "My dear girl," Major Dale began helplessly. She stopped him by lifting her hand. "Please do not call me that. Not tonight. There are moments when long weakness burns off like mist and leaves behind a shape no one has quite known was there. It was so within now." Even Vera looked at her differently. Renshaw said, "This strengthens your own statement that there was a quarrel." "Yes." "And gives you motive." "Yes." Stephen sprang up. "For heaven's sake, and must you answer like a martyr in a melodrama? Motive is not murder." "No," said Poirot. "But sometimes love is near enough to confuse the issue." Stephen turned on him with sudden violence. "If you intend to suggest my wife killed her mother for my sake, I suggest nothing. I observe that both of you are willing to take ruin upon yourselves more readily than shame." That struck home. Stephen's anger broke oddly. "Shame," he said, and laughed without humor. "My dear sir, in this house shame was served with every meal. One simply learnt which fork to use." The phrase, because it was true and because it came from such a man, silenced them all. Poirot saw then the emotional fact that made Stephen more comprehensible than likable. He had come to depend on Anne's loyalty, as weak men depend on air, yet he genuinely could not imagine life improved by her suffering. That innocence and selfishness often appears monstrous to disciplined natures like Lydia's. Nevertheless, it is not the stuff of deliberate murder. Renshaw requested everyone's handwriting. While the samples were being fetched, Poirot returned alone to the morning room. The body had been covered now. Death under a sheet acquires a greater decency and a greater accusation. He stood before the writing table and considered the arrangement of objects, the leather tray, the pens, the seals, the candle with wax run sideways, the chair still nearly square. He bent and looked at the carpet under the desk. There, caught in the nap close to the skirting, glimmered a tiny crescent of blue silk thread. He picked it up and laid it on his palm. At his shoulder Renshaw said, "From Mrs. Harcourt's sleeve? Possibly. Or from a dress, a scarf, a ribbon. But it asks us a question." He rose and replaced the picture once more, not quite touching it, merely studying the slight gap at the lower corner. Then his gaze dropped to the mantel. The 3 silver swans stood in a row, but the middle one pointed fractionally outward, as though beginning to leave the others behind. Beside it the red wax streaks still marked the polished metal. "Inspector," said Poirot, "who used sealing wax after dinner?" "Miss Grant says she did." "Yes." "And who else might?" Renshaw considered. "Anyone writing secretly." "Just so. But the wax on the swan is not spattered. It is rubbed. Something sealed and still soft was pressed against it, or brushed by it in haste." When they returned to the library, Vera had produced a packet of Lady Rosamond's recent correspondence. Among it was an unsigned note demanding that a certain paper be replaced behind the lake picture or consequences would follow. The language was educated, cautious, and curiously indirect, like that of a person accustomed to issuing instructions without seeming to do so. "Whose paper?" asked Renshaw. "That is not said," Fenwick replied. Lydia read the note and frowned. "This is not Stephen." "No," said Stephen. "I lack the patience for anonymous grammar." Renshaw looked from one face to another. "Then perhaps Miss Elcombe? Or Mr. Fenwick?" Vera said icily. "If I had wished to threaten Lady Rosamond, I should not have done it on paper." "A useful distinction," murmured Poirot. Fenwick said, "The note might equally have been written by a woman protecting another." The words were innocent enough, yet when he spoke them he glanced not at Anne, but at Lydia. Poirot stored that away. Fenwick had the habit of seeing inheritance wherever emotion tried to stand. Then Baines appeared again, carrying on a tray the abandoned coffee cups from the drawing-room, which no one had remembered. "Beg pardon, sir. I thought perhaps these should not be washed." Poirot's eyes brightened. On Lady Rosamond's cup a dark stain remained at the rim where lipstick had touched porcelain, and stared at the tray as if it contained not cups but verdicts. "Excellent, Baines," said Poirot. "Tonight the house is full of silent witnesses. We must be polite to all of them." He was polite to the cups by carrying them himself to the morning-room table and examining them under the lamp. There was coffee in most, but Lady Rosamond's held chocolate, thicker at the sides. Stephen's cup contained no sugar. Major Dale's spoon still rested within his saucer. Vera's cup had been finished to the bottom. On ends there remained a faint crescent of lipstick, and clinging to the handle, the ghost of a fingerprint blurred as if touched twice. "Poison?" asked Renshaw. Dr. Henley shook his head. "Not needed. That knife was enough." "Then why the interest?" "Because," said Poirot, "when people are agitated they carry their habits with them. Cups tell us whether a person rose once or twice, whether a hand was steady, whether a tray was moved before or after the cry." He pointed. Lady Rosamond's cup stood on its saucer exactly centered, the spoon aligned at 4 o'clock. Anne's cup, by contrast, had left a small chocolate smear near the tray's edge, though she had not been drinking chocolate. That meant little by itself. Yet in such houses accidents are biographies in miniature. He asked Baines who had brought in the tray. Mrs. Copley took her ladyship's cup through to the morning room after the key was missed, sir. Mrs. Harcourt followed with the sugar basin because her ladyship had called for more hot water, and closed her eyes. Yes. I had forgotten. Forgotten? Perhaps. Or chosen not to remember that she had been alone in the room even before the quarrel. Renshaw's face showed satisfaction. Poirot's did not. A servant entered to say that Constable Price had found marks on the terrace. They all went out by the French window, the night air damp and smelling of reeds. The stones below were dark with mist. Near the balustrade, in the shelter of a stone urn, lay 2 cigarette ends and the blackened stub of a match. Major Dale claimed one brand at once. The other was Turkish. Stevens? Asked Renshaw. Stephen bent, examined it, and shook his head. My dear Inspector, if I am to be hanged, let it not be for bad tobacco. I smoke Virginius. Who smokes Turkish then? No one answered. Vera said at last, Lady Rosamond forbade smoking on the terrace after dark. That alone should make it Mr. Harcourt. They descended the steps to the gravel and moved toward the lake where the garden narrowed into clipped yews and a path to the boathouse. The surface of Blackmoor lay black and level under a thinning of cloud. A lantern from the constable showed, on the boathouse door, a smear of fresh mud near the latch. Renshaw pushed it open. Inside, the small skiff bumped softly against its chain. There was no one there, but on the bench lay an oarlock wrapped in newspaper and a woman's overshoe half hidden beneath it. Mrs. Copley gave a cry. That is not mine. It is mine, said Vera Elcombe. All turned. She did not blanch. I looked for Rosamond here after the cry. I crossed the lawn in haste and lost it. Renshaw's eyes narrowed. Why not mention that before? Because I saw no connection until now. The inspector lifted the overshoe with 2 fingers. Its sole was damp, but the mud on it was drying. Another easy road opened before him. The severe companion, out at night, smoking Turkish cigarettes, moving between house and lake with an undisclosed purpose. Poirot looked instead at the skiff. One seat had a dustless patch shaped like a rectangular packet lately set down and removed. Upon the newspaper wrapping the oarlock, a speck of red sealing wax clung like dried blood. Outside, the clouds shifted and a skin of weak moonlight spread across the water. Through the open boathouse door the windows of Blackmoor Hall shone in a line. One, the morning room, gave back a pale oblong. It seemed to Poirot then that the house itself was watching the lake and withholding speech. Vera said in a clipped voice, You may as well hear the rest. Lady Rosamond asked me this afternoon whether I had touched the lake picture. I had not. She believed someone had taken a paper from behind it. She told me not to interfere. Naturally, I interfered. I wrote the anonymous note to frighten the thief into replacing it. Fenwick stared. You? Yes. If Rosamond chose to govern by provocation, I chose to counter it by concealment. That was my mistake. Her self-command faltered not on the confession itself, but on the word mistake. One heard under it an older note, 11 years of loyal correction, resentment harnessed to usefulness, affection forbidden the dignity of its own name. Why the boathouse? Asked Poirot. I came here at dusk because I saw Anne walking toward the lake with something in her hand. When I called, she turned back. I found nothing, and stared at her. You never told me that. No. Vera's mouth tightened. I had no wish to add your mother's suspicions to your unhappiness. This shifted the air again. Vera, who had seemed hard, now stood unexpectedly exposed as a woman whose devotion had worn the clothes of criticism for so long that no one recognized it when it bled. Poirot's gaze returned to the house. In the distant morning-room window, above the lamp, the watercolor of Blackmoor Lake hung like a smaller darkness inside the larger one. If a paper had indeed been hidden there, then the boathouse, the terrace, and the hall tray were not three different puzzles but one movement, interrupted by murder. Renshaw closed his hand on the overshoe. We go back, he said. And this time no one keeps anything back because it seems unimportant. No one kept anything back, yet the truth did not therefore become eager. It had to be drawn, turned, and held to the light like old silk. In the morning room Renshaw arranged a reconstruction. Baines stood where he had seen Lady Rosamond last at coffee. Mrs. Copley described carrying in the chocolate. Anne, at the inspector's request, retraced her own steps with the sugar basin in her hands. She crossed the threshold quietly, almost unwillingly, and paused by the desk. My mother was here, she said. She had the picture down. That admission startled everyone more than if she had screamed. You did not say this before, said Renshaw. I remembered it only when Miss Elcombe spoke of the lake. It seemed at first one of my mother's odd tidying fits. She had taken the picture from the wall and was slipping something behind it, or taking something out. I could not see which. She put it back at once when I entered. Poirot inclined his head. Memory often returns not in sequence but in association. More important than the fact itself was the manner of its arrival. And did not sound as though she were inventing. She sounded like a woman horrified to discover that truth was assembling itself against her. What then? Asked Renshaw. She told me to set down the basin and leave her. I did. Then later, after she accused Stephen, I came back and begged her not to send for Mr. Fenwick. Did she mention the hidden paper? Anne's face changed. Yes. Stephen swore softly under his breath. She said she had proof at last that I could not be trusted to act for myself. She had intended merely to protect me from my husband. Now she must protect my child from both of us. She said the paper behind the picture would make me understand how far matters had gone. And did you see that paper? No. That no lay between truth and falsehood so delicately that only Poirot seemed to notice its balance. She had perhaps not seen it then. Renshaw made her step back to where the chair had stood. Would Lady Rosamond have been seated? And looked at the desk, the angle of the covered body, the position of the lamp. Yes. She sat down while speaking. And you? Here. She stood on the carpet beside the right arm of the chair. Then a struggle? No. Again that roomful of listeners moved inward without moving at all. If there had been no struggle, then the crooked picture and fallen blotter were either trivial or arranged. And if arranged, by whom? Poirot bent to the carpet and showed Renshaw the little blue thread he had found. Suppose, he said, that after the blow someone reached upward or forward in haste. Renshaw examined the slit backing on the picture frame, and then Anne's cuff. The inspector's expression darkened with the dangerous satisfaction of a theory returning improved from holiday. Stephen stepped between them. This is monstrous. Stand aside, sir. No. For once there was nothing decorative in him. He stood quite still, and his voice, stripped of charm, was that of a frightened man who has come upon the limit of his own selfishness, and finds he must cross it. If my wife says there was no struggle, it is because she cannot bear ugliness. That is how she was brought up. She would apologize to the guillotine for bleeding on it. And said his name, but softly. Poirot looked from one to the other. The emotional truth of Stephen lay naked at last. He would lie badly, lose money foolishly, and ruin futures carelessly, but when driven to the wall he chose and before himself. That did not acquit him. It merely made the inspector's easy picture of a calculating son-in-law less complete. Renshaw ordered that Anne's sleeve be examined. At the seam a tiny catch remained indeed, with a fibre missing. It matched the blue crescent on Poirot's palm no more certainly than a shadow matches another shadow. Still, the room received it as confirmation. Vera, standing near the mantel, put out a hand to steady herself against the clock. The silver swans trembled faintly in their row. One had been turned backward without anyone noticing. Its small blind had faced the wall. Poirot's gaze sharpened. He crossed and turned it again. On the polished shelf beside it lay a minute flake of brown paper, torn from the backing of the frame. Not newly fallen, it had rested there long enough to gather a little dust on one edge. "Inspector," he said, "who replaced the picture after you examined it?" Renshaw frowned. "I did not. Perhaps Miss Elcombe." Vera stiffened. "I touched it only earlier." "Then someone else touched it later," said Poirot. Lydia spoke abruptly. "When the doctor came in, and leaned against the desk. I remember because she put her hand out toward the wall as if she might faint. And closed her eyes." "Yes." "Did you touch the picture then?" "No. But you could have," said Renshaw. The reconstruction ended not with certainty but with a concentration of suspicion so severe that the air itself seemed thinned by it. Fenwick asked quietly whether it would not be best for Anne to rest. Renshaw replied that it would be best for no one to rest until the key and missing paper were found. At that instant Baines, who had gone upstairs in search of a stronger lamp, returned with an object in his hand. "Beg pardon, sir." This was under the stair runner near the landing. It was Lady Rosamond's dispatch key. Everyone looked first at Anne, because she was nearest the stairs when Lydia saw her. Poirot alone looked at Vera, whose face had become not guilty but suddenly, terribly resigned. Poirot looked at Vera because resignation is often more incriminating than fear, and because innocent people rarely receive a discovered key with the face of one who has expected it. Renshaw noticed the look and acted at once. "You know something, Miss Elcombe." She did not deny it. "I know too much," she said. The inspector led her a little aside, though in such a room privacy was merely a form of politeness. "Did you put the key under the runner?" "No." "Did you see who did?" A pause. Then, with immense fatigue, "I saw Anne on the stairs. She dropped something. She did not notice. I was below. Later, when the house was in confusion, I found the key and pushed it out of sight." Renshaw exclaimed. "Why?" "Because at that moment Lady Rosamond was dead and Anne looked as if she might cease to exist next. I wanted time." There was silence. Vera had confessed not to murder but to loyalty, and loyalty in a murder case is nearly as troublesome. And put a hand to her throat. "You did that for me?" Vera answered harshly. "Do not be grateful. I am tired of rescuing people who would rather be judged." The bitterness did not conceal the feeling beneath it, rather it gave that feeling its weary outline. Poirot reflected that devotion, when denied ordinary tenderness, often chooses tyranny as its uniform. Renshaw said, This is obstruction. Yes, said Vera. I know the word. He turned to Anne. Why had you the key? And looked from face to face, and seemed to see in all of them not accusation only but the old household order closing round her once more. Fenwick prepared himself, Lydia stiffened, Stephen moved instinctively nearer. Poirot saw the choice forming in her. One kind of woman lies to preserve a life she has built, another tells the truth because she cannot endure one more arrangement imposed from outside, and had never before been permitted to discover which she was. I took it from my mother's tray before dinner, she said. I meant only to look at the will. I was afraid of what she might do to Stephen, to us. But I could not open the dispatch case. I had not courage enough. When the key was missed, I slipped it into my pocket. After my mother was killed, I forgot it was there until I ran upstairs. Then I dropped it. Stephen made a sound of despair. You little fool. She turned to him almost gently. Yes. But not for the reason you mean. That confession transformed the whole shape of the evening. And had stolen the key. And had lied by omission. And had returned from the morning room agitated. Anne's sleeve was torn. The path toward her guilt now seemed so smooth that Renshaw could scarcely keep impatience from his voice. You visited your mother twice. You had the means to look into the dispatch box. You had reason to fear the paper behind the picture. Miss Elcombe hid the key after you dropped it. Mr. Harcourt's case was in the hall, where you might have taken it. What remains? Poirot answered before and could. The thing that remains, Inspector, is always the same, certainty. He moved back into the morning room and stood before the covered body, the writing table, and the lake picture. One by one the others followed. The room had grown weary with being examined. Even the flowers Vera had arranged seemed to have lost their intention. Yet under fatigue details persist. Lady Rosamond, said Poirot, sat here. She had first taken down the picture and either hidden or removed a paper. Later her daughter came, there was a quarrel, and Lady Rosamond spoke cruelly of the child being sent away. After that came the blow. So far, perhaps, we all agree. Renshaw nodded. But if Mrs. Harcourt struck at once in passion, why the careful placing of the cigarette case by the hand? Why the opening of the window? Why the torn blank half-sheet left under the shawl? Those are not the gestures of panic. They are the gestures of a mind already trained by another mind in the management of appearances. And gave him a strange look, almost of relief. Poirot's fingers touched the lower corner of the picture frame. And here is still our little witness. This frame was not merely disturbed. It was removed and replaced twice. First by Lady Rosamond herself before the murder. Later by the murderer, who took from behind it the paper the dead woman had mentioned. Still later, after the inspector's first examination, it was touched once more by someone searching whether anything remained. And, said Renshaw. Perhaps, said Poirot. But there is one more question. What was the paper? Fenwick answered reluctantly. If Lady Rosamond wished to frighten her daughter into obedience, it may have been a memorandum transferring guardianship. I drafted one such possibility last week, though it was not signed. Stephen swore at him with sudden heartfelt clarity. Lydia looked at Fenwick with contempt. Vera closed her eyes. Poirot turned. Monsieur Fenwick, you will oblige me by asking everyone to join us here in 10 minutes. No one absent. We have climbed many steps. It is time to reach the top of the staircase. Renshaw protested that he had not yet arrested anyone. Just so, said Poirot. Let us not do the final thing before we have done the small exact things that make it honest. As they began to move, and remained where she was, staring at the picture of Blackmoor Lake. For the first time since the cry, she seemed no longer frightened of discovery, but of the truth she herself would have to speak when speech became unavoidable. Stephen moved first to draw up a chair for Anne, but she did not take it. She stood by the hearth while the others gathered in the drawing-room at Poirot's request. Inspector Renshaw with his notebook closed at last, Fenwick erect and uneasy, Major Dale heavy and miserable, Lydia pale with attention, Vera Elcombe in black composure, and Baines discreetly withdrawn. Beyond the long windows the first colorless light before dawn lay upon Blackmoor Lake. When one climbs a staircase, he said, one reaches the top by steps, not by leaps. So let us take the steps. No one interrupted. First, Mr. Stephen Harcourt. Everything accused him too perfectly: debt, quarrel, window, cigarette case. But the case had been seen in the hall after dinner. It was placed by the body for us to admire. Mr. Harcourt is careless, selfish, and often foolish. He is not orderly enough to stage a scene in the instant after a killing. Second, Miss Vera Elcombe. She wrote the anonymous note. She concealed the dropped key beneath the stair-runner after Lady Rosamond's death. She went to the boathouse. All this is suspicious. But Miss Elcombe interferes to protect, to suppress scandal, to manage others against their own interests. She does not kill in order to free herself. Third, Major Dale. He owed money and feared exposure. But men like Major Dale endure humiliation until it becomes part of the furniture. His emotions are immediate. The scene in the morning room was not immediate. It was composed. Fourth, Monsieur Fenwick. He drafted the will, the trust, even the possible guardianship arrangement. He had knowledge. But his mind arranges through documents. He would trap with clauses, not with a cigarette case laid theatrically beside a dead hand. Poirot's voice softened. So we come to the center. Lady Rosamond was not attacked in a struggle by the window. The chair remained square to the desk. The disorder was selective: a fallen blotter, a guttered candle, the open French window, the conspicuous cigarette case. Someone, after the blow, arranged disorder. And who had been trained all her life by Lady Rosamond in the art of arrangement? Her daughter. Anne's hands came together. She looked not at Poirot but toward the paling glass. Mrs. Harcourt stole the dispatch key before dinner. She admits it. She feared what the will might contain. Later, when she carried the sugar basin, she saw her mother with the lake picture in her hands. Lady Rosamond had hidden there a paper stronger than any will, a memorandum by which Anne's child was to be sent away and Anne herself reduced to an allowance and obedience. Then the key was missed. Lady Rosamond accused, threatened, and summoned her daughter to submission in the morning room. She sat at the desk, still certain of victory. She spoke of the child being sent away. She spoke, too, of Anne's weakness. In that instant, Anne saw the end of her marriage, her child, and her own claim to direct even the smallest part of her life. She struck with the paper knife. It was not premeditated. It was one violent second of revolt. And shut her eyes. But after the blow came something else, said Poirot. Not cold blood exactly. Habit. She did what Lady Rosamond herself would have done in crisis. She arranged. She took the paper from behind the picture, tearing the backing and catching her sleeve. She opened the French window. She placed by the body the cigarette case taken from the hall. Perhaps she meant to protect her husband. Perhaps also she wished him to feel some part of the ruin he had helped to bring. Human motives are rarely kept in separate drawers. He turned toward the morning-room door, visible from where they stood. In the room beyond, the watercolor of Blackmoor Lake hung quiet at last. That picture was our silent witness. We all supposed its crookedness meant struggle. It meant something more intimate. Lady Rosamond had taken it down to hide her design, and took it down again to steal back one fragment of her own life. The picture did not witness the manner of the crime, it witnessed the reason for it. Poirot continued more gently. Miss Elcombe found the key later and hid it because she guessed enough to fear the rest. She has been protecting not a murderer, but the remnants of a woman she pitied. And Mrs. Harcourt, who could endure humiliation for herself, could not endure it for her child. There is your motive, not greed, though money touched it, not hatred, though years of tyranny fed it, but the desperate revolt of a heart managed too long. And opened her eyes. The timidity had gone out of her face. What remained was grief and a kind of exhausted honesty. It was the school letter, she said. Behind the picture. She had written to Switzerland already. She said Daphne would be made firm there and spared my mistakes. Then she said I had always chosen weakly, loved weakly, and that at least my child might be saved from me. She put her hand to her mouth. I did not mean to kill her. I only meant that she should stop speaking. When she fell, I saw what she had made of me. I thought of nothing clearly except that the letter must not remain. From the breast of her gown she drew a folded paper and gave it to Fenwick. He scarcely looked at it before lowering his hand. Renshaw did not need to read it. Dawn widened over the lake. At Blackmoor, he said at last, order was loved more than kindness. And when that happens, disorder comes in the heart before it comes in the room. Renshaw stepped forward and bowed her head. Poirot picked up the pack of cards still lying where the game had broken and squared them neatly against the table. Now, he said, we may put the room in order. The end.